apologize for it. I can't think of appropriate words to describe this. Actually, there's plenty of competition for moral depravity in the current strange moment of human history. Perhaps the prize goes to a bureaucracy, maybe in honor of Kafka, Trump's National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. A couple of weeks ago, they produced a long, detailed study recommending an end to regulations on emissions. And they presented a rational argument. They pointed out that extrapolating current trends, turns out that by the end of the century, we'll be over the cliff. Automotive emissions don't really contribute a great deal to the catastrophe, so there isn't any point in trying to limit them. So in brief, let's rob while the planet burns, putting poor Nero in the shadows. Notice the background assumption. Background assumption is that everyone in the world is as criminally insane as we are and won't try to do anything to avoid the crisis. This document surely qualifies as a contender for the most evil document in human history. There have been plenty of monsters in the past. Hitler, Attila the Hun. But it would be hard to find one who was dedicated to undermining the prospects for the continued existence of all organized human society, and not in the distant future, and all to put a few more dollars in already overstuffed pockets. And it doesn't end there. But the same can be said about the major banks that are increasing investments in fossil fuels, knowing full well what they're doing, or for that matter, the regular Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Well, I mentioned the major banks. Turn to the major media and the business press. Regular articles celebrating U.S. success in rapidly increasing oil and gas production, with a lot of commentary on the importance of energy independence, booming profits, sometimes a few words on local environmental effects, but quite regularly without a phrase on global warming, which is a truly existential threat. On October 8th, the IPCC issued its regular report on the state of the climate, much more grim than earlier ones. It warned that within a decade or two, we have to severely reliance on fossil fuels if there's to be any hope of keeping global warming below truly catastrophic levels. And recall that this is a consensus report. It's very conservative, as past ones have been, and they have regularly been found to have underestimated the threats. Shortly after this, the New York Times had a long, detailed report co-authored by its climate reporter on Trump administration decisions to open up huge tracts of land to fracking in Western states, expecting to double oil and gas production in 2019 in Wyoming alone. The article reported that the move is generating windfalls for the companies and effects on wildlife, local water supplies. In about 1,000 words, the article manages one phrase on the effect on the global environment. It points out that part of Trump's radical deregulation eliminates an Obama-era rule curbing emission of methane, which it points out is an earth-warming gas that's roughly 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide. That's all. Same in the election campaign. Scarcely a word about the issue that's merely the most crucial one in all of human history. Actually, hardly a day passes without more information about the severity and imminence of the threat. So a couple of days after the New York Times article, a study appeared in Nature showing that retention of heat in the oceans has been greatly underestimated, which means that the total carbon budget, the amount of carbon we can use without total disaster, is much less than was assumed in the already ominous IPCC report. A study calculates that maximum emissions would have to be reduced by 25% to avoid warming of 2 degrees centigrade, which is well above the danger point. At the same time, polls show that half of Republicans deny that global warming is even taking place. And of the rest, almost half reject any human responsibility. And no doubt they are influenced by their leaders, who they trust more than the media. It's a major achievement of today's Republican Party, which, as I've said before, is the most dangerous organization in human history. I concede that that's an outrageous statement, which regrettably happens to be true. It's hard to describe, to find words to describe what is happening before our eyes. And the same is true of the second existential threat, nuclear war. A few weeks before the election, as you know, Trump announced that the U.S. was withdrawing from the INF Treaty. The treaty, Reagan-Gorbachev Treaty, eliminated short-range missiles deployed in Western Europe and Russia. And missiles that are extremely hazardous because they have only a few minutes flight time to Moscow. That poses a decapitation threat of destroying any capacity to retaliate. Of course, that sharply increases the danger of a massive nuclear response to warnings given by automated systems that have often failed in the past. And that would end all of us. Anyone familiar with the record knows that it's a virtual miracle that we've so far avoided nuclear war. And miracles you can't count on going on. Now, the threat that was already grave was heightened by the Trump nuclear posture review that authorized new destabilizing weapons, and it lowered the threshold for nuclear attack. And this latest move, withdrawing from the INF Treaty, increases the threat further. Again, scarcely a mention on the campaign trail or in coverage. The U.S. is withdrawing from the treaty on the grounds that China is not a partner and that the Russians have violated it. The Russians, in turn, claim that the U.S. has violated it. It's quite obvious how to address these problems through inspections and diplomacy, neither of which have been attempted. Rather, let's just blithely increase the threat of total destruction. And let's ignore all of this and the vast outpourings during the political campaign. Well, let's put aside the most significant questions in human history and return to what is considered within the realm of discourse. The election once again demonstrated the failure of the Democratic Party to deal with issues that matter to working people. Even more than before, the Democrats lost the college-educated white population. On the surface, it seems that this can be attributed to the success of Trump's racist, xenophobic appeals. There was success, which does tell us something about the society. As you may recall, Trump was pulling a leaf from Ronald Reagan's playbook. Back in 1985, our brave cowboy leader strapped on his boots, declared a national emergency because Nicaraguan forces were only 2 days' march from Arlington, Texas, and people didn't collapse in laughter. And it's the same when Trump warns that if some of the women and children fleeing it from misery and oppression actually reach our borders, they'll all try to kill us. Misery and oppression for which we happen to be largely responsible, but put that aside. So it's necessary for heavily armed militias to travel to the border to back up the 15,000 troops sent there to defend us. And amazingly, it seems to have worked. The surveys report that people did vote for Trump because he's the only one who can save us from destruction by these criminal hordes. Now, that does carry lessons. And when we ask why it works, I think we find something deeper, something which is pretty much worldwide. Particularities from place to place, but some fundamental similarities. So keep to the United States. In the US, working class people have suffered 40 years of stagnation, while wealth concentrates in very few hands. But the Democrats have not only ignored all this, worse than that, they've carried forward the neoliberal policies that took off with Reagan and Thatcher and have imposed these consequences by design. From the perspective of the designers, the neoliberal programs have been a brilliant success. Inequality has reached staggering levels. Sure, you've all heard the numbers. Top 1.1% of the population now have as much wealth as the bottom 50%, a great many of whom have practically zero wealth. The rules of corporate governance were changed in ways that allowed executive compensation to soar by 1,000% since 1978. Meanwhile, real wages for non-supervisory workers have actually declined, and it continues under Trump. Despite low unemployment, the wage growth, which did rise a little in 2014 and 15, is now declining. It is now no longer even keeping up with inflation, which means real wages are stagnant or declining during the period of extremely low unemployment. Unions have been subjected to bitter attack by a combined offensive by the state and private capital, with the help of the most reactionary Supreme Court in living memory, getting worse. Financial institutions have exploded in scale. They have also changed radically from service to the real economy, as was the case during the great growth period of the 50s and the 60s, to now speculation and risk with enormous profit. They've reached 40% of corporate profits before the crash 10 years ago, the crash for which they were largely responsible. Deregulation under Reagan and Clinton and beyond, right at once, it led to financial crises. There had not been any before under New Deal regulation. Each one is more severe than the last. But that's no problem for the perpetrators. They're very handsomely supported by the taxpayer, not just by the highly publicized bailouts, but also by more subtle and significant means, such as access to cheap credit, and inflated credit ratings, thanks to the tacit government insurance policy. Now, that's actually the source of most of the wealth of the great banks, according to an IMF study. Well, from the crashes, the financial institutions emerged richer, more powerful than before, while the victims suffered. And a side effect of great significance is that the country's wealth is being shifted from research and development, innovation, product development, to financial transactions in the interest of the very rich, which is fine for the super rich, but disastrous for the health and the future of the society. These socioeconomic achievements have been accompanied by doctrinal ones. To see how far elite ideology has shifted to the right during the neoliberal years, it's useful to look back to what was considered conservatism a few years earlier. The views of President Eisenhower, for example. So here's Eisenhower. I have no use for those, regardless of their political party, who hold some foolish dream of spinning the clock back to days when unorganized labor was a huddled, almost helpless mass. Only a handful of unreconstructed reactionaries harbor the ugly thought of breaking unions. Only a fool would try to deprive working men and women of the right to join the union of their choice. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, to eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter, of course, that believes you can do these things. Among them are a few Texas oil millionaires and an occasional politician or businessman from other areas. Their number is negligible and they are stupid. That's conservatism, the vintage 1950s. Well, they may have been negligible in total numbers, but they were very far from stupid. They have triumphed under Reagan, Thatcher, Clinton, and to the present. They've now basically taken over both political parties, the Republicans to an extreme extent, and a good deal of the intellectual culture. It's kind of interesting that today Bernie Sanders is considered a radical revolutionary, far off the political spectrum, for voicing beliefs pretty similar to Dwight Eisenhower's. It tells us a lot about what's happened in the past couple of generations. The achievements of the neoliberal economy greatly impressed elite opinion that included the economics profession, which hailed what they called the Great Moderation. They confidently assured the public that recessions were a thing of the past. Now that sophisticated market theories were able to keep inflation under control and ensure steady growth, to be sure, for a very small percentage of the population. The master of economy, Greenspan, was called St. Allen, considered one of the great economists of the ages. That was before the whole structure that he supervised collapsed in a shambles that would have become worse than the Great Depression if had it not been for drastic actions to somehow rescue the economy. Well, while he was still basking in glory, St. Allen instructed Congress on the reasons for his success in managing the flourishing economy. His success, he explained, relied on what he called growing worker insecurity. As he explained, the workers were so intimidated that even when unemployment was very low, they were simply afraid to ask for better wages and benefits. And that's very good because it means that there's no inflationary pressure, and we didn't bother to mention it. It means that profits can soar sky high. Again, what's happening today? Well, that was during the boom of the 90s, which soon led to a bust, though nothing like the crash 10 years ago, which was caused by predatory lending for homes, complex financial instruments to obscure the sheer robbery, all thanks to deregulation. Can you hear me? Stop the game. Let's see.
They can hear. They can hear.
Hear me again? I've had a lot of experience with these video conferences. In third world countries, they sometimes break down, also in the United States. Some lessons there too. Well, going back to the boom of the 90s, when St. Allen was explaining about the wonders of greater worker insecurity, well, that led to a bust, nothing like the last one. After the crash, Congress passed legislation. Legislation would have two parts. First part was to bail out the perpetrators, ended up richer than before. And the second part was to help the victims, the homeowners, who were devastated by the predatory behavior of the banks and financial institutions. Well, anyone who understands the logic of modern capitalism could easily have predicted which of the two prongs was executed. It was a giveaway to Wall Street executives, the special inspector general of the bailout program, Neil Farofsky, argued, complaining bitterly about the failure of the Obama administration to pursue that half of the legislation, of course, in vain. Well, the general public may not know the details, but nevertheless, they can readily grasp what's happening. Their anger and resentment makes them very easy prey for a con man who pretends to be their defender against the hated elites, while in fact he's stabbing them in the back at every turn. The prime example is the most prized achievement of the Trump administration, the tax bill that economist Joseph Stiglitz described as the U.S. Donor Relief Act of 2017. The bill lavishes gifts on the very wealthy corporate sector and brings an extra benefit. It created a huge deficit on purpose, of course. The purpose was cheerfully explained right away by Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, the architects of the program. As they pointed out, we now have this terrible deficit, and in order to deal with it, it's necessary to reduce the already meager social spending for the general population, health, education, food support for the poor, other irrelevancies of the neoliberal era. Well, this growing worker insecurity that St. Allen lauded as the basis for a healthy economy, that's been enhanced by the way employment has been changed during the neoliberal period. Increasingly, the economy is designed to create a precarious existence, what's sometimes called a new precariat. The mass of the victims are sometimes called. There's a recent study by two prominent labor economists, Princeton, Lawrence Katz, Alan Kruger. They found, I'm quoting them, that 94% of the net employment growth in the US economy from 2005 to 2015 appears to have occurred in alternative work arrangements. 94%, part-time, temporary, irregular, a few employer commitments, individual arrangements. Well, people who are cast aside by social and economic policies and see a bleak future, they quite naturally feel resentment, anger, fear, and it's all too easy for these feelings to be directed to scapegoats, commonly those who are even more vulnerable. That's particularly true among populations that have been atomized by policies that are aimed at undermining the social order, guided by Margaret Thatcher's famous maxim that there's no society, only individuals. That was Thatcher's unwitting paraphrase of Karl Marx, who bitterly condemned the authoritarian rulers of Europe in the mid-19th century for seeking to turn society into what he called a sack of potatoes, an amorphous mass of isolated people who confront concentrated power alone. Concentration of wealth and power automatically translate to decline of democracy. The means are too familiar to review. Extensive research has shown that by now a large majority of voters are literally disenfranchised, and that their own representatives pay no attention to their wishes, but listen to other voices, the voices of the donor class, top tiny percentile. It's furthermore well established that elections are pretty much bought. Electability and hence policy is predictable with remarkable precision by the single variable of campaign spending that works both for the executive and for Congress. Tom Ferguson's work is particularly revealing. It goes back into the 19th century. It includes the 2016 election. And that's a bare beginning. During the neoliberal period, the number of lobbyists has just exploded. Legislation is commonly shaped, even sometimes actually written by corporate lobbyists, while the representatives who sign it have their eyes on funding for the next election. As both parties shifted to the right in the neoliberal years, the Democrats, as I mentioned, have abandoned the working class, and the Republicans have just drifted off the spectrum. And the leadership understands that. They understand that they cannot get votes on their actual policies. So what they've done over the years is to try to mobilize a voting constituency on other grounds, what are sometimes called cultural grounds, keeping away from the crucial socioeconomic policies. One very revealing case of this, one of many, is the matter of abortion rights. If you go back to the 1960s, the Republican Party was strongly pro-choice. That included the leadership. Reagan, Ford, George H.W. Bush, Bush the First, Goldwater, and others. And the same with Republican voters. In 1972, 2/3 of Republicans believed that abortion is a private matter. The government should have no involvement. Well, Nixon and his cohorts realized that, and along with their famous Southern strategy, they could attract the Catholic vote, which had usually been Democratic, simply by adopting a strong anti-abortion plank. A couple of years later, evangelicals began to be organized for political action. The Republican operative, Paul Weyrich, he recognized an opportunity. Among the demands of the newly organized evangelicals was demands for segregated schools. The virus realized that you can't call for that, but he had another proposal, namely the Republican Party should pretend to oppose abortion. And if it did, it could pick up the evangelical vote. That's now a core part of Trump's voting base. And the leadership accordingly shifted to passionate pro-life advocates. Reagan, Ford, all the rest. That included those who are sometimes believed to have some character and honesty, like George Bush I. Well, meanwhile, of course, the actual Republican constituency remains as it has been, at great wealth, corporate power, even more brazenly so under Trump. And it's quite an impressive achievement to serve the actual constituency with dedication while somehow maintaining hold on the voting constituency, a voting constituency that is shrinking. The leadership understands that they're becoming more and more a minority party, which is, of course, why they're so dedicated to find modes of voter suppression and packing the courts with reactionaries who will support their efforts, as the Roberts Court has so far done. The election highlighted related and ominous developments. So the Republicans increased their Senate majority. How? With 42% of the votes against 57% for the losing Democrats. Right now, 60 senators are elected by 25% of the population. That's rural, white, religious, heavily armed, and the tendency is increasing. It's hard to see how some form of civil conflict can be avoided if this continues, unless the Democrats reverse course sharply and become a political party that doesn't simply abandon the working class as they've done for 40 years. Looking briefly elsewhere, very briefly, there are similar developments. In Europe, a combination of neoliberal policies called austerity in Europe and flaws in EU governance, which place power in Brussels away from the national communities. These exacerbate the problems. The resentment against formal democratic institutions shows up in election after election, and it should come as little surprise under these circumstances. There's some local differences, but quite similar factors are involved in the catastrophic election in Brazil just a few weeks ago. It's going to have enormous consequences. One of them of worldwide significance is that one of the policies of the new, literally, neo-fascist leader is to open up the Amazon to exploitation by agribusiness and mining, which could be a virtual death knell for the species. That's one of the main sources of carbon sequestration. Well, despite all of this, there are quite a few bright spots that relieve the general malaise. All over the world, lively, energetic, popular movements are arising. They're working hard for a sharp reversal of the dismal course of the past generation. In the US, the Sanders movement broke radically from over a century of US political history. It's the most significant aspect of the 2016 election. And the offshoots of the movement are hard at work, along with others, with considerable impact. Same is true with Corbyn in England, of AMLO in Mexico, and much else throughout the world. And the achievements of the recent past provide their own powerful lessons about what can be achieved and inspirations to commit ourselves to it. One should never underestimate the obstacles that lie ahead, nor the capacity of the human spirit to overcome and to prevail.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah, that's better.
Okay, well, there's a whole bunch of questions. I've tried to condense them. This is 2 or 3 questions in one. What accounts for the rise in hate crimes and intolerance? Is it all on Trump? Are we seeing the onset of fascism?
Hate crimes.
Hate crimes. There is a rise in hate crimes. That's well documented. We can't blame it all on Trump. In fact, I think there's a deeper reason. The circumstances that allow a character like Trump to appear with dog whistles and hints to incite hatred, violence, to turn the very natural resentment and fear in pathological directions. But the fundamental reason, and it's not just in the United States, worldwide almost, is the impact of the socioeconomic policies that have been instituted almost worldwide in the past 40 years. Differences in different places, variation, but they're pretty much the same. The so-called neoliberal policies oriented to benefiting the business world, the extreme wealthy, the corporate sector, and essentially cast aside the mass of the population. That creates conditions under which somebody like Trump can inflame latent fears and concerns and simply stimulate the kind of hate crimes that we're seeing. Is it fascism? No. Fascism is a serious thing. It was a set of socioeconomic policies in which a powerful state organized and controlled the society, served big business, but controlled it, was not controlled by it as in today's economy, and led to excesses which are too horrible and well known to bother describing. I have to say that given my age, I can recall the 1930s. I can recall the fear from a child's perspective of the rise of the fascist plague over Europe. It seemed unstoppable. I can remember listening over the radio to Hitler's Nuremberg rallies. Couldn't understand the words, but there was no mistaking the nature of the crowds. And when I hear Trump's rallies today, sometimes so disgraceful, or hardly words to describe them, like ridiculing the woman who was the victim of sexual assault, and listen to the crowd roaring, does bring back memories. I think there are things to worry about, pay serious attention to, but it's not yet neo-fascism.
Here's another question. Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sounds like an early KGNU broadcast, doing interviews. Are you there? Can you hear me? How has U.S. policy contributed to the refugee crisis in Central America?
Very straightforwardly. U.S. policy in Central America has been harsh and brutal back to the late 19th century. But in the 1980s, very sharply escalated. Reagan carried out a series of vicious terrorist wars in El Salvador, Guatemala, a base in Honduras, which became a base for also heavy repression and torture. There was one country that suffered severely from the Reaganite wars, Nicaragua, but it's the one country that had an army to protect it. So it wasn't quite as bad as in the others. In the others, the army were the state terrorists. The effect of this was hundreds of thousands of people killed, many hundreds of thousands tortured, widows, orphans, countries devastated. There were truth commissions which attributed the overwhelming majority of the atrocities to the state terrorists backed and supported by the United States. In Guatemala, in many ways the worst. In the early 80s, there was literal genocide against the Mayan population by the dictator Rios Montt, one of Reagan's favorites. He called him a man totally dedicated to democracy, who's getting a bum rap from the human rights organizations. As if this wasn't bad enough, the policies continued afterwards. During the war, huge numbers of people fled to the United States. Many young people, Salvadorans and Los Angeles and other places, a lot of young people fell into the oppressed areas of the United States, the slums of Los Angeles, joined drug gangs, made their own drug gangs. Then they were deported back, where they're terrorizing their society. Then take a look at the country that's providing the plurality of the refugees, Honduras. Why? 2009, there was a mildly reformist president in Honduras, Mel Zelaya. He was kicked out by a military coup. This was condemned all through Latin America by most of the world, with one exception. The Obama administration refused to call it a military coup, because if they did, they would have had to stop funding the military junta by US law. There was an election, fraudulent election run under the military regime, again condemned by almost all countries, praised by the Obama administration as an important step towards democracy. And it gets worse. Honduras became one of maybe the murder capital of the world. And now it's sending most of the refugees. So that's the background. If we had a minimum level of civilization, we would not only be treating the refugees humanely, but working hard to try to rebuild what we've destroyed. They don't want to flee their countries. They'd much rather be there if it was possible. That's where the main direction of our activities should be. I should say, to mitigate these criticisms, in Europe, it's just as bad or maybe worse. Europe has a certain history in Africa, which we need not review. And when people are fleeing from the wreckage of Africa, including the recent wreckage of the Libya war, but far broader and deeper, what happens? Thousands of them drown in the Mediterranean. Europeans fund Turkey to accept millions of refugees, keep them away from Europe's borders. Italy turns them back. Italy, incidentally, which opened the 19th century with the first major genocide in Libya, but now you turn them back when they're fleeing, and it didn't end in the 19th century. This is a problem and a crisis of Western society, which is just shattering to think about, particularly when you recognize that there are countries that are reaching a sort of civilized level. So in Lebanon, poor Lebanon, 40% of the population are refugees. Same in Jordan. Same in Kenya, the biggest refugee center. Same in Bangladesh, huge number of refugees. Uganda is not only absorbing refugees, but providing programs for them. But that's the kind of level of civilization that the West just can't aspire to, which is something we should really be thinking about.
Is there any connection between U.S. foreign policy rooted in militarism and imperialism and the violence that we're experiencing here inside the United States?
Well, if you think about American history, the imperialism didn't start recently. The United States is one of those very rare, maybe unique countries which has been at war almost constantly from its first day. We don't call it imperialism, but remember that one of the main reasons for the Revolutionary War was that the British were banning settlers from moving past the Allegheny Mountains. And the settlers, including great land speculators like George Washington, wanted to move to the West. And what happens when you move to the West? You're at war. You're at war with the Indian nation. It's a bitter war which continued without a stop to the end of the 19th century with many.
1 second, Noam.
They were doing. This, John Quincy Adams simply described the fate of that hapless tribes of Indian nations, which we are exterminating with such merciless cruelty. Meanwhile, we conquered half of Mexico, including where I'm now living, in what General Grant, President Grant, called one of the most wicked wars in human history, a war of aggression. Then comes the 20th century, constant interventions, war, post-Second World War period, intervening all over the place, the Vietnam War, the worst atrocity since the Second World War, the Iraq invasion, the worst atrocity of this century. It's a long history. So it's
Thank you for your patience. What about the possibility of a wider war, for example, an attack on Iran to distract attention from domestic issues?
Well, the United States is certainly, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. The United States is certainly setting the grounds for an attack on Iran. You have to remember that Iran has been an enemy since 1979, when they overthrew the dictator that the U.S. had imposed in a coup 25 years earlier. And they've been, since then, they've been independent, not following orders. That's not tolerable. Right after the 79 overthrow of the dictator, the U.S. immediately turned to support for the Iraqi invasion of Iran, supporting our friend Saddam Hussein. Huge, hundreds of thousands of people killed, poison gas, chemical warfare. Right after that, harsh sanctions, which continue. There was a slight break when the Obama administration did agree to negotiate terminating the Iranian nuclear programs. It was quite a successful agreement. Not just the U.S., the European countries, the major European countries, China, Russia, everybody joined in. The Trump administration has pulled out of it, of course. Now it's imposing much harsher sanctions. plenty of threats of up to the level of regime change. I don't think that they're crazy enough to invade Iran. They learned some lessons in Iraq, a much weaker target. But I think there is a possibility that there could be an attack. Bear in mind that the U.S. is organizing an alliance of the most reactionary states in the region, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt under the harshest dictatorship of its history, Israel right in the center of it, all under the U.S. aegis, to try to ensure the imposition of U.S. domination over what remains the world's major center of energy resources and area of vast geopolitical significance. Could lead to an attack, but I suspect if there is one, it would be from a safe distance, cruise missiles, bombers, and so on, which would have horrible consequences.
What's the best way for people to combat the negative influence of right-wing media like Fox, InfoWars, Red State, The Drudge Report, and all the rest?
To support stations like KGNU. That was an easy one. You planned it that way.
I'm saving the easy questions for the end. How to achieve a break with the dominant capitalist paradigm?
How
to achieve a break? How to achieve a break? Economic order?
Well, there's only one way to do it. A large mass of the population must come to recognize that the system is too resistant to efforts to reform and improve it, to allow further such efforts to persist and then move to further actions. We're very far from that. There's plenty of room for very significant reform. In fact, as some of the quotes I gave earlier indicate, if we were to go back to Eisenhower conservatism, it would be a big step forward, a big step forward. I remember those were the years of what's sometimes called regimented capitalism. The New Deal regulations were still imposed. Banks were banks, no financial crises, no massive speculation and predatory institutions. It was the fastest growth period in American history, egalitarian growth. The lowest quintile did as good as the highest. There was plenty wrong with it, plenty of horrible things, but by contemporary standards, it had severe defects, like the achievements of the 1960s hadn't yet taken place, but in socioeconomic terms, it was improved. That's why you have sentiments like Eisenhower's, and we can certainly go far beyond that. There are ways to erode the capitalist structure from within, and they're being undertaken. So one important series of developments is the spread of the very large-scale spread of cooperatives, worker-owned enterprises, localism, and food supply, many other initiatives of this kind, which sort of build the institutions of a fairer, more free society within the present one. And that could continue. How far it can continue, we don't know. But such efforts have to be pushed to their limits. And again, it's only when a great mass of the population recognizes that the limits can go no further that you can anticipate constructive, substantial, even revolutionary change.
Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist philosopher who died in 1937, he talked about morbid symptoms arising as civilizations decline. I'd like you to talk about that, and also his famous adage of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will.
Yeah, that's Antonio Gramsci from his he was sentenced to prison in order, as the prosecutor said, openly, in order to silence his voice. Became one of the leading political prisoners from the 20s. Incidentally, that's just happened again in Brazil, where the most popular candidate, Lula, as he's known by everyone, who was set to win the election, was sentenced to what amounts to life imprisonment and solitary confinement, banned from receiving any public information, and crucially banned from making any public statement. This was right before the election, which he was set to win. The alleged crimes, whatever you think about them, are so utterly disproportionate from the nature of the sentence that it's creating a political prisoner, which is very reminiscent of Gramsci, in order to silence this voice forever. And in prison, Gramsci in the early 30s did talk about what he said is that the old order is collapsing and the new order has not yet arisen. And in this interregnum, there are many morbid symptoms, and that looks familiar. The old order is collapsing. All through Europe, every election, the centrist political institutions are declining, eroding. New forces are developing, unfortunately, on the right, also on the left. And very much the same happened here. The 2016 election, the Republican Party was pretty much wiped out. It became the Trump Party, which actually serves the same masters, but not the individual who the establishment preferred. On the Democratic side, the most spectacular development was the Sanders movement. The first time in American political history that person who was basically unknown, no media support, no financial support from the wealth or corporate power, came very close to gaining the nomination, very well might have gained it. That's just a sharp break, and very similar to what's happening in Europe. Incidentally, also in Brazil, the center-right party, the party of the previous prime minister, Cardoso, disappeared, was totally wiped out. Instead, a neo-fascist extremist one. The party, the center-left, declined severely, partly its own fault, but it did under terrible attack. And out of this does grow morbid symptoms, the kind we were talking about. Xenophobia, racism, misogyny, hate crimes, and so on. And it could get more serious. I mentioned before something quite significant about the American political system. What made a certain amount of sense in the 18th century, with all of its severe flaws, the American constitutional system was a step forward. Plenty wrong with it. Well, big step forward by 18th century standards. Even the very phrase, "we the people," which was revolutionary at that time, putting aside how it was implemented, but the idea. You take a look today, that same political system is so regressive, it would not be accepted by, say, the European courts if a new country came in with that political system. And with the radical shift that's taking place, where already 60% senators are elected by states with 25% of the population. That means are elected by maybe 15% of the population, tendency that's growing, and a sharp split dividing. You can see it on the electoral map. Unless the Democrats can become what they once sort of were, a party of working people and the poor, at least to a large extent, unless that can happen, there may be some really severe morbid symptoms.
Sounds like you're putting your bets on the Democrats to reform.
No, I'm putting my bets on the public to compel the Democrats to reform, which is something quite different, and also to curb what the Republicans are doing. When I said the most dangerous organization in human history, I wasn't exaggerating. We have to bear that in mind. You can't find any organization in human history which is doing what the leadership is doing, knowingly, consciously moving towards imminent devastation in order to enrich a few super rich people. You can't find an analog to that.
Just a couple more questions. You doing okay?
Yeah.
Great. How do you reach people who are oblivious and impervious to facts?
By trying harder.
Do you even bother?
Oh, yeah, you try harder. We're all human beings at bottom. First of all, you have to understand why. It's not just, I'm a moron. There are background reasons that have led to this situation. And some of them are pretty clear. For example, many of the working class people who voted for Trump voted for Obama. They didn't vote for Obama because they were racists. They voted for Obama because they believed his rhetoric about hope and change. I don't usually quote Sarah Palin, but she had a point when she asked what happened to this hopey, changey business. Within a couple of years, people could perceive that the hope and change was nice, fancy rhetoric. Already by 2010, just 2 years after Obama's election, there was an election in Massachusetts, the most liberal state. The election was to replace Ted Kennedy, the liberal lion. The Republicans won the election, largely because even union workers were unwilling to get out and vote for Obama after what they'd seen. So that there's a background. There's a background for the reason why people are angry, very resentful, hating political institutions, easy prey for a con man. And if he tells them, I'm your hero, I'm defending you, and maybe they believe it, then they'll believe him when he says, don't believe the media, don't listen to facts. Just listen to the facts are what Jared Kushner recently called false reality. Nice phrase. Yes, people are prey to that, but it's not their genes. It's circumstances that have created it, and those can be changed.
You've hinted at a couple of possibilities for political action. What else needs to be done in the next couple of years, given the eco-crisis that is about to envelop us?
Well, two major things have to be done. There are two truly existential threats cast a shadow over everything else. One is nuclear war, and we know how to reverse that. We can return to arms control treaties, in fact, much better ones. We can cut off the threat of possible war in Iran. There are very straightforward ways of doing that. It's going to take large-scale public pressure and activism, but that's within our reach. It's happened before. The activism of the 60s made it a much more civilized society. There's probably more people engaged today than there were then. And if they're organized and dedicated, they can achieve a lot. The second is ecological catastrophe. And we simply have to heed the warning of the IPCC, which, as I said, was soon after shown to be underestimated, and terminate the use of fossil fuels. These initiatives that were just voted down in the last election, they have to be instituted. People can institute them. They can carry out actions in many ways, from changing to LED bulbs to using solar panels to political action, and ultimately it really has to be on a massive scale. This also includes things we should not overlook it, like industrial meat production, which is extremely harmful in many ways. not even considering the animals. But one of the things it's doing is adding enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. All that can change. There are many ways to work. There's time to hold things back and reverse course. There also ought to be much more research and development on advanced technology. It's scandalous that solar technology is spearheaded in China, a poor country. That's where they're producing not only the great majority of the panels, but the most sophisticated ones. We have to look at things like decarbonization, many other things. So there's many directions in which activity has to proceed, and that's just the existential threats. When we talk about these other things, they're within grasp. In fact, I didn't pick up your reference to the maxim that Gramsci made famous. We should think about it seriously. We can have pessimism of the will, but pessimism of the intellect, but we should have optimism of the will. That's our only hope.
Tell me about your visit to Lula in prison in Brazil. Why did you go, and what transpired?
Well, Valeria, my wife, and I, she's Brazilian, we went to Brazil in large part to become involved in the torrid political activities there before the election. And one of the first things we did was arrange to visit Lula in his prison, Curitiba, which is possible to do in a very limited way. He's allowed very limited visitors. And, at the time we visited him, it still looked hopeful that there might be a way to beat back this neo-fascist threat. Right now, it looks pretty horrible, but nothing's ever over.
Talk about the future of work in light of rapid strides in artificial intelligence and robotics. What are jobs going to look like in a few years?
Well, first of all, it's worth noticing that so far, at least, there is no real indication that robotics, although they're coming along, are having a really visible effect, detectable effect on jobs. If automation was really having a major effect, you would see it in productivity. The more working people are replaced by robots, the higher productivity measures. Productivity is extremely low. It's well below what it was in the 50s and the 60s. Now, this is coming. There's no doubt. It could be a very good thing, could be a very bad thing. Depends on how the technology is handled. If automation and robotics eliminates dangerous, boring, mind-destroying occupations and frees people to be more creative, independent, to pursue their own interests, to enhance their capabilities, even to have more leisure, that's all to the good. Speaking of leisure, Americans are enormously overworked by Western standards, by the standards of, given the wealth of society compared with others. Americans work 5 or 6 more weeks a year than Europeans, which is insane. You know? So if robotics could have all of these effects, that's beneficial, but it depends who's going to have their hand on the lever. That could easily happen if an organized, engaged, activist population has their hand holding the lever. If the hand is private concentrations of power, it's going to be different and very ugly. But the technology doesn't care. The technology can be used for good or for ill.
There are young people in the audience in Denver and in Boulder. What advice would you give to them?
What advice? Optimism of the will. And support KGNU.
Finally, so many interviews seem to turn on this question of hope. and people are curious about you personally in terms of what inspires you.
What inspires me is things like the fact that, say, right here, there's a lively activist community. It's lasted for a long time. The Community Radio Center is an energizing force. There are things like this all over. As I mentioned, the Sanders campaign broke with well over a century of American political history. That's pretty impressive. And the offshoots of it are active, effective, doing lots of things. They're very important. The younger people entering the political system, like Ocasio-Cortez and others. And there were defeats in this election, but there were victories too. And we should, as I say, remember what the past was. It wasn't very long ago that the United States had laws which were a model for Nazi Germany. In the late 60s, as late as the 1960s, the US had anti-miscegenation laws so severe that when the Nazis were developing the Nuremberg laws, their racist laws, and looking for precedents, they did pick the American laws. They were the only ones they could find. But the American laws were too severe for them. The Nazis weren't willing to go as far as the one drop of blood requirement. That was the 1960s. As late as 15 years ago, we had anti-sodomy laws. Think about as late as 1975, women were not considered peers in the legal system. It was only in 1975 that the Supreme Court guaranteed the right of women to serve as peers in federal juries. It was one part of a very substantial change. Enormous changes took place through the activism of largely young people against many barriers, much harsher barriers than today, and a lot was achieved. There was a harsh reaction. The neoliberal period is in many ways a reaction to that. But we start now from a higher plane. We have the legacy of those past achievements, and plenty of people are taking advantage of it. That's plenty of reasons for hope.
And saving the most difficult question for this right now. What famous intellectual activist was born in Philadelphia on December 7th, 1928, turning 90 years old?
Well, if you look at his birth certificate, it says Avrain Naomi Chomsky, because this is a sign of the change of the times. The name is Avrain, Noam, but some clerk couldn't believe it. So he crossed the name out in pencil and changed Noam to Naomi and Avrain to Avrain, because women are allowed to have crazy names, not men. Oh, that wouldn't happen now.
Well, on behalf of everyone here, Noam Chomsky, thank you so much for joining us and supporting community radio.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Noam Chomsky and KGNU.